So, I did a video last week and I enjoyed the process, so I decided to do one this week too. For the wonderful story of Henry Sugar, I would like to talk about first with the question of how the story kind of unfolded. Because in the other article we had to read for this week, the structure, beginnings, middles, and ends, it talked about how um, when you examine the structure of a story, you want to consider certain things. And the first question that the professor asked this week is, does the action unfold chronologically, or does the action jump around? So he asked us to explain kind of the structure of the story. So I would say that it does jump around a little bit. There are many timelines that Dahl does utilize here, because first we have the one story start out with Henry Sugar. It starts talking about his life a little bit, and then he picks up this blue pamphlet. And in this blue pamphlet, there's a story about the guy who can see with his eyes, covered up. Like, so the guy who can see through things. And this guy's name is, hopefully I will say this close to correct, Imhart Khan is this guy's name. The miracle man who sees without his eyes is what they said. By the way, I'm referring to my story because I like to have copies printed out instead of reading completely online. So I would say that Dahl's storyline does jump around a lot, though, but he's really good at this. The story covers a lot of time because, like I said, from when Henry picks up the story, then we hear the inside story of this man, and that covers a little while, him telling this other guy the story. And then after that, when it's back to Henry, like, him having read the whole story, after he reads it, Henry, then it takes him 3 years to try to obtain these powers like the man in the story had. And so actually there are, like I said, multiple timelines going on. And so someone could get confused maybe a little bit, but Dahl's amazing at doing this, and he uses like keywords, and key ways of phrasing things to show that, he's changing in and out of the storylines. And the fact that how much time does the story cover? It ultimately, it covers years and years, really. I said, like, it took him like 3 years to actually do this stuff. So he read the story, right there in one sitting from what it seemed. And then after that, it took him years to get these powers that he had. And then the question says, ultimately, how does the structure serve the story? Why tell the story in this way? I felt like the structure served the story necessarily because this big, gigantic story of Henry Sugar, he's this wonderful man, this amazing man. And it's a great story he has here, So it kind of needed to be explained why he even was interested in gaining these type of powers, or knowing that he could get these type of powers. So him picking up like the book kind of and reading it and then going from there, it was just very interesting and needed. It was an interesting way of showing it, instead of saying like Henry Sugar, then he read this book and then got these powers from this person. It was good to hear the whole story of the person before who had these special powers and what he did to obtain those powers. I thought the story was really long, but I felt it was at the end worth reading because of having that inter-story within it. And it's interesting because right now I'm teaching Frankenstein to my Euro literature students. And the thing is with Frankenstein, a lot of you I'm sure have read it, that there is a story within a story there too, but it's definitely not as complex as this one is, even for a short story. But there's Dr. Frankenstein telling the guy who finds him, on the water, telling the man his story, and then the rest of the story is Dr. Frankenstein's life and how he built the monster and everything like that. So I think a lot of times you have to be careful when you structure stories within stories, but a lot of times they do it in movies and TV shows, like How I Met Your Mother, did it and stuff. And so I feel like Roald Dahl, though, was very good at doing it. And I felt that ultimately, telling a story this way just adds a different complexity to it, really. What aspects of the story were emphasized? What aspects of the story are summarized or glossed over? So the aspects of the story in my mind that were really emphasized were the facts of how this man, obtained his powers. And for the reason I think those were emphasized was having Henry Sugar read this, then he's like, wow, this man, I needed to know, exactly how he did it so then I myself can figure out how to obtain these powers. So like any person picking up this blue booklet could read this and they know exactly how they could possibly obtain these type of powers. So I felt like those aspects were emphasized for that reason, so Henry could obtain these powers himself. But the aspects of the story that seemed glossed over a little bit or left out were many, like way too many details, maybe other details related to the man's life in this story, the yoga man's life, and the way that in the yoga man, but there's a lot of different ones, in Emhart Khan's life, is that where like there wasn't much talk about his personal life other than him, obtaining the ability to see without his eyes, and the same with kind of after we were just really focused on Henry Sugar at first. Before he read this story, we were focused on different aspects of his life, but then after he read it, we were only focused on him obtaining these possible powers. Why does Dahl condense some parts of the story while accentuating other parts? I think he does this, as I said, because it shows like the meaning and morals of the stories are tied into, this idea of this man being able to read the story and then figure out how to do it himself. And then at the end of the story, like the yoga thing kind of changing his mind in a way, and him opening up these orphanages. And the beginning, Henry Sugar was this man who didn't seem like a great guy, but then at the end of the story, from concentrating on something like that, it didn't become about the money. It later became about something else entirely. So I thought Dahl did that to just show that he's like, this is what's most important about the story. The story's kind of long and winded in some ways, but this is the most important parts are the ones I'm accentuating here. Consider how Dahl depicts the passage of time and how he's able to tell a story that spans decades in search a relatively few pages. Well, Dahl, I mean, as I said, he does this so just easily because he talks about, he just introduces it simply as, Henry picks up this blue booklet and listens to the story. And then this man's like telling, it's just key little details of him telling the story and how his life went past and how many years it took him. And then once Henry puts down the book, he's focusing, concentrating, doing these things and working week by week on things. And then before he knew it, it was 3 years later. So Dahl just does a very good job of slowly making time pass, throughout the short story and not making it seem like, that much time really has passed in a few pages. So The Wonderful Story of Henry Sugar is the longest short story you said, like we've read. And I said at points it felt like it, but overall at the end it was just like a great story. It differs from the different stories we've read so far, I think, because as you mentioned, Margaret Atwood or Tobias Wolff, their stories weren't broadscapes. I don't think that they could have done what Dahl did with either one of their stories, because to me, their stories weren't like, they didn't have an extra element to make the need to tell like a story within a story. They were clearly like Tobias Wolff, his was like a chain of events happening, which was great, but I don't think they needed to be like a chain of events that happened over like years or decades or anything like that. That wouldn't be needed in his story to really tell the meaning behind it. And with Margaret Atwood, that story definitely worked the way it did because it happened. I mean, like, obviously she was waiting a long time to get like revenge in some ways, but with that happening, she didn't need to tell, like I said, a story within a story the way Dahl does, because it's interesting to know a little bit about Henry Sugar, but then he reads the story and like his life changes, and so I feel like Dahl like took it as far as he could to show that it takes time, and like the idea of, I do yoga myself, so the story like was relevant in some ways, obviously some of it was like seemed far-fetched, but it was relevant in the way that when someone does a yoga practice every day, like if they mess up one day, they have to go back. It's just like a dedicated thing you have to keep doing. And so I think Dahl wanted to show that this man, lived one type of life and then dedicated his life to doing something. And then it took a long time, but over time he changed like into a different type of person, more enlightened or whatever. So I think he needed to tell his story in this type of span of decades. And I just don't think Margaret Atwood or Tobias Wolff needed to tell their story in any different way than they did. And in what ways is Henry Sugar similar, strictly speaking, to the other short stories? I think this story is similar, though, to those stories because, like, with Tobias Wolff, there was a chain of events, and he was good at showing, how each event, like, fit together. And that's and the same with Margaret Atwood, how each event and thing that happened in development with the structure of the middle, beginning, and end worked. And Dahl did the same thing. He had a great beginning, middle, and end, but his story was just cut further out, into a larger span of beginning, middles, and ends. And that's pretty much like they're very similar in that way. His story is just much longer and drawn out. So last but not least, what can we learn from the story and how, I apply or you guys apply some of these approaches and techniques to our own story is I think we just have to remember, like in the second story I did, I think I've learned how like possibly you can like zone in more on the type of developments you want to have. So I focused on this second story I did, having it all happen in pretty much one day / one night. Because for me as a new story writer, I think that's like a good way for me to put it, because I'm not doing anything too complex yet, because I, completely don't know much about short story writing still. So I'm just like learning from doing that. So I felt like finding ways to just like focus in on like one plot and doing like over in one day span thing was a good idea for me. But what I can learn from Roald Dahl is that, it's okay to take these chances. It's okay to experiment and try new things. And the idea of having a character be your main point at first, but then adding another little story level in there. So even if I started with, like, say, a main character and then added another little story that he read or saw or something in that, and just like had it a shorter story, obviously, than this Roald Dahl character, taking things so far and making it so amazing and like interesting, I can just start and kind of like maybe attempt a little bit, like step my foot in and try to do like a little bit of where there's a story within a story pattern. Because I think he does this amazing, he has an amazing way of starting, like you said, a beginning, middle, and end, and like seeing it all the way through. And so I just got to remember in my stories that, I can have a beginning, middle, end, but it doesn't have to be so clean cut. I can try different things and experiment like he did. Thank you very much for listening to my video. I don't think it was a perfect video this week by any means, but I'm sorry, I've been sick most of the day. I'm losing my voice a little bit. But I think this went pretty well, and I'm looking forward to responding to some of your guys' posts and you guys watching my video. Thank you very much.